I'm very excited to invite Rob here to talk with us because Rob is a good example of multidisciplinary research in cyber, where he has many different expertise hats. You've got law, you've got AI, so technology. You've probably got a bit of business as well. Would that be right, Rob?
Somewhere, yes.
And Rob and I worked at University of New South Wales together for Cyber and had a really fun time working together there too. So I'm just very excited to hear what Rob's latest research is and what we can learn from what he has today. I'm going to move him over to you guys.
Oh, that's great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation to come and have a chat here today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today, what I'd like to do is look at issues associated with digital twins. And although Monica has kindly said such nice words in her introduction, she'll be familiar with some of the material I'll be presenting today. But also it has developed, and some of the issues that relate to digital twins and the detection of mis, dis, and malinformation is some of the issues that I'll be looking at. So broadly, what I'll be trying to do today is give you an introduction to digital twins, why, not from a technology perspective, but how they fit into approaches which are used by businesses in a business environment, because I'm from a business school, but how they're regulated as well. So how they fit in, how they're applied in certain sectors, the financial sector in particular, for RegTech, some of the cybersecurity issues that they raise, before moving to models of people. And I want to have a look at how do you model people in a digital twin, with a particular emphasis on one digital twin that I'll mention, but also how you might model the cooperation of people, because ultimately the issue associated with particularly the propagation of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation is the way that people interact both with the information that they're transmitting and others. And I'll try and draw some conclusions. Of course, and as a spoiler alert, the major conclusion is there is further work to be done in this area. Okay, digital twins. This is not a particularly difficult concept. The idea behind having a digital twin is to create a model of your physical environment and then use that model to determine how the physical environment can be optimized. So what you need in the model is a series of individual models which model the elements that create your enterprise or whatever it is that you're modeling. So for example, if we were trying to work out what the air conditioning temperature should be in this room, because that's always wrong wherever in academia you are, whichever room you're in, it's always the wrong temperature. You might take as inputs, well, what's the traffic been around the Clayton campus? Are the buses running on time today or are they running late? What's the foot traffic been coming into this building? What's the outside temperature? Pretty logical. What's the university prepared to pay for cooling as compared to what the university is prepared to pay for heating? So we actually need to know something about the cost of energy and actually the time of day cost of energy. So all of those things which, so yeah, but that's just AI. Yes, it is. But to get the temperatures right in multiple rooms concurrently, essentially building a twin of the actual rooms may be an effective way of doing it. And the twin itself doesn't have to be entirely digital and is best if it isn't entirely digital. So using information from sensors in the real world, like the thermostat associated with the air conditioning in this room, can start to give an interface between the twin and the real world. So the twins use AI, machine learning, data analytics, all of the normal tools that you would use in automation, but they're used in an environment where the physical world can essentially learn from the digital world. And that can be some huge model like the one that I'm trying to put together for optimizing the energy costs of this building, or a very small model, because actually a small model can give you some insights which can improve efficiency, even if it's only slightly, in a way that can benefit the enterprise. Ultimately, so digital twins, I am from the business school, of course, I'm going to use the Gartner hype cycle somewhere in a presentation. So the master data management people reckon that digital twins still on the innovation trigger, citing Gartner. Gartner in 2023 doesn't have digital twins on the hype cycle. They did in 2018 and 2020. So they're on the way up at the moment and not yet in the trough of disillusionment. But as I might suggest, Industry 4.0, which probably is sitting in the trough of disillusionment and arguably may never get out of there, is a sector which is seen to be reliant on digital twins. Okay, now Chris will love this, because one way of actually building digital twins is to use standardization from ETSI, which really is the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. So oddly, but not related to anything from BEREC or any of the other regulatory groups within the EU. The EU, ETSI has proposed a series of service interfaces, next generation service interfaces and linked data, as a mechanism for modeling a digital twin. You could use object-oriented approaches as well. It's just that, in particular in Europe, there's been an approach that says, well, yes, but object-oriented isn't as well standardized, it's widely used, but less standardized than having a complete abstraction of a process which might be used to actually describe what digital twins do. So all you essentially need is entities, properties, and relationships, and you can build up your model using those features. Developing a digital twin is actually quite hard, though, because conceptually, yes, well, all we're going to do is model the physical world, but in practice, giving that as an instruction, produce us a model of what we do, is as hard as saying, well, go away and replicate what we do. And part of our strategic advantage is that nobody has gone away and replicated what we're doing. So it is a process which includes a number of different steps, some of them fairly obvious: collect information, analyze that information, learn from it, optimize it, innovate, and then repeat, rinse and repeat lots of times until your model is actually reflective of what's going on in the physical world. But once you've got to that trained model, then you can actually start to change what the twin is doing in order to see other things that we can be doing better in the physical world. And so there are a whole bunch of benefits from digital twins. Most of them are essentially associated with efficiency. So that reduce operational costs is, although it's only one of the 6 things around the digital twin, it's the thing that drives it in many enterprise environments. So why do you want a digital twin? Yes, it's to reduce cycle time, improve productivity, but really it's a cost reduction strategy. I've mentioned in the abstract for this session that I was going to have a quick look at RegTech. If you're a financial services business, building a digital twin could be used to produce not only efficiencies, but that efficiency and risk management trade-off, which is the heart of financial services provision. So if you can build a model of your business, you can use that model to actually do risk assessments. Clearly, this presentation would have had a lot more weight a week ago, but before Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse suffered the issues. But actually, I'm going to argue, no, if they had digital twins, then putting in a scenario into the digital twin, which says, shockingly, the cost of capital isn't going to stay at 0.25% forever. And if we have an inflationary cycle, which we could probably predict it might happen from about, I don't know, February last year when Russia invaded Ukraine, wars are always bad for the economy and the potential issues, supply chain issues that would flow from that. I'm ignoring COVID in this, could potentially lead to inflationary pressures. And so the issue that potentially a digital twin could be used for in a financial services environment is actually doing stress tests, which are significantly more effective stress tests than the regulatory ones that are imposed at the moment. Because frankly, the regulatory stress tests at the moment are saying, well, what's your tier 1 capital? How could you draw on it? And if interest rates go up by 3%, 300 basis points, what would be the effect on your business? Well, that is a fairly static model and probably would have missed large amounts of what's supposed to be tier 1 capital sitting in treasury bonds at low returns. And because they're at low returns, even though they've got a par value of, let's say, $100, that's the amount that you've got in your regulatory capital, if you try to actually liquidate those, they'll actually produce you $94, and that's Silicon Valley Bank gone. It's part of the reason for the failure of Credit Suisse. In practice, many businesses financial services businesses do use digital twins for risk management, but it tends to be quite confined to a specific sector rather than the whole of a bank. So using a digital twin to work out the effects of mortgage rate increases is certainly done, but using that to say, well, how will the whole of the bank perform if the mortgage sector does this is at least not transparently done. The reason I'm particularly interested in digital twins for RegTech is regulatory reporting, because, and this is done, the way that some financial services businesses do their regulatory reporting, saying, here's a bank or some other financial services institution, but let's assume here's a bank, here's my twin of the bank. It's easier for the twin to generate regulatory reporting than it is for the bank to generate it. And because the twin is a twin of the bank, we'll report from the twin. which sounds great, unless you're a regulator, in which case, is that really a twin of the bank, or is that some gaming process within regulation designed to give me numbers which aren't actually the reflection of the state of the bank? And if you're a prudential regulator, that is a supervisory regulator, is supervising a twin actually the same as supervising a bank? And sadly, these are fundamental regulatory questions where the banks currently take the view that, no, it's the twin, you'll be right. And that potentially is an issue, particularly when one of the reasons for having a twin is to try and identify where there may be a regulatory breach. So if the twin does identify it, that goes back off to the physical world fairly quickly. And the twin acts in a way which is consistent with regulation, while the physical fixes up the potential breach of regulation and feeds that back into the twin at a later date. Because we're worried about cybersecurity, this is not a very interesting list of the potential issues with digital twins. Yeah, sure. Or I can repeat the question if that's easier.
So I'm just trying to understand the digital twins application in the scenario of banking.
Yeah.
Because let's say for normal industry or for building control, I can understand that because there are like vast sensors that are in the physical world, and you could have the batch and automated control.
Yeah.
But for banking, like the example you give for the mortgage, my understanding is that there is a lot of manual operations and human will be involved in those operations. Then how to get that data to supply, to the digital world is something that I'm not fully understanding.
Okay, so each time there is a manual intervention, essentially it's still it's a query on a database. So you can use the query on the database as if it was an actuator, or as if it was a sensor, so that you can essentially create the digital twin like a physical, is that door open or shut? By using the way that there is a manual intervention, you can use the way that there is electronic intervention. So funds flow, what were the number of repayments? What proportion of the repayments were made at interest only rather than interest and principal? What proportion have failed to make their payments in any particular month? But you can also take other inputs. So the way that mortgages are cleared uses the Reserve Bank's RITS system, and the way that's a netting system for the banks. But ultimately, you've got transaction records which say, let's say I'm NAB. Well, I'm clearing $100 million worth of mortgages today. That is, the mortgages are being discharged. I'm entering into, it's a Friday, $120 million of new mortgages. The clearing ones go off, it's 100 million, 30 to Combank, 30 to ANZ. This month it's odd, it's 40 to, or this day it's odd, it's 40 to Westpac. They're clearing with me, they're going to net those off. I know what my clearing inputs are. I know what my net is. Those are all inputs to the twin.
Right. So if I understand correctly, the key challenge in this process is to have a replication of the more transparent and accountable and auditable digital source or database.
Yes, but it's part of it's to get a holistic view, because often and historically, essentially the answer in the management accounts is, yeah, we cleared $100 million of mortgages and we wrote 120 million more, rather than start to do the more detailed look at where did those occur. Whereas the twin can actually model a national network and start to provide on a dashboard you are lending way more in Perth than you were a few months ago. The Perth property market is much more volatile than the Melbourne property market, and providing input which may be useful to overall management.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. So most of the cyber security issues are potentially the same as you'd find in any electronic system which actually interacts with the real world. So a twin could potentially be compromised. It's made a little bit worse because there aren't as developed cybersecurity standards for twins. You might say, well, we know what API security should look like. I think that's a reasonable thing to do, but there's no, as yet, standardization that says, well, if you use best practice in APIs, you're going to start to get to a reasonable security practice for a twin. I think part of the issue is that the twin could potentially, especially in financial services, be a honeypot because of the amount of information that it has. It's also potentially really interesting to a competitor, even if it's less interesting to a cyber criminal, but because it's interesting to a competitor, it might be interesting to a state actor. Okay, so, oops, let me do that. So I'm going to go to a very specific form of digital twin that I've done some work on, Monica's done some work on, and we've got colleagues also doing some work on. And this is Meta's twin of essentially both Facebook and Instagram, but it was originally built for Facebook. It's called DubDub, WW, rather than WWW. But that's actually just a lie. It's called WW for Westworld because it's a cyber representation of Facebook. It only has cyber interactions. So there is no interface to the physical world, but it's where Facebook, where Meta starts to look at what happens with the way that people interact with each other. And the issue with DubDub as a digital twin is that Facebook's really interested in two things. One, what could go wrong and create a further reputational damage? Let's say it might be something going viral which actually damages Facebook's reputation because it went viral. On the other side, there's also, what if something good goes viral and as a result of that, advertising increases? Both are fundamental to Facebook's interest in this, but one has a bit more of a financial motivator than the other. So the DubDub world has 2 billion bots in it. So 2 billion agents that interact with each other. And it tries to work out how real Facebook is going to operate. And the way that that's done currently is to have 4 forms of bot. So a rules-based bot, a machine learning bot, a random bot, and a hybrid, which is a hybrid of 2 or 3 of the other ones. And so far, that's been really fine. That's enabled Facebook to be able to work out in its digital twin some of the effects of potential changes to its product offering in the physical world. What Monica and I did in making a proposal to Meta was to suggest that you could do better than this set of bots. And I'm going to give an argument why. So in the real world, you get issues which are a flow from complex adaptive systems, and they lead to issues of emergence. And the voids, because it comes from a very old piece of software called voids, emerge from a random collection of agents placed in a field. And there are only 3 rules for each of these agents. So separation, voids don't fly into each other. Alignment, you steer towards the average heading of everybody else in the flock. And cohesion, try and move to the middle of that center. And those 3 rules lead to the types of outcomes we're seeing here. Looks like flocking. So what do you have? You have an agent. It has a simple set of rules. That is, the agent is boundedly rational. And this, even with a very few rules and a collection of boundedly rational agents, you get the emergence of patterns. And a complex adaptive system essentially just has this phenomenon of emergence. And I think there's a strong argument, and this is the argument that Meta was concerned about when it was looking for work in this area, that actually what you have in a social network is a large collection of boundedly rational agents, and that the potential for something which is fabulously good and viral and something which is horribly bad and viral arises from the potential emergence phenomenon that is associated with complex adaptive systems. And it's just a bunch of boundedly rational agents. And ultimately, you've got the issues which create this, which are nonlinearity, emergence, and states of stability. So in the Boyd's model, the stability is a flock. You also get chaos. So essentially, you've got stability, chaos, and something really interesting in the middle. Chaos is boring, stability is boring. It's a bit in the middle that's interesting. And just to give you an idea of just how simple a model can be, this is the logistic equation, which is the number of animals that will survive in a habitat at a given point in time, given a certain amount of food. And essentially, you can start to see a point where you move into some interesting complexity and chaos. So bifurcation, interesting complexity, chaos, in an equation which actually only has 2 terms. So this is, I think this is an indication of how interesting this is. So Facebook's got a particular interest. Its interest is how do you characterize bots in the cyber world and identify bad behavior in the physical world. And one of their approaches is to use dub. There's also the potential for actually building a simulation, because you can get social media platforms which are in the open sourced and run on Docker. You could actually start to play with this in the real world, or rather in a lab, without being too difficult. The problem that might lead to Facebook missing complexity is those 4 different bot types. Because essentially, if you're going to model people, the easiest way of modeling people is to say, well, people use heuristics 98% of the time to make decisions. And we do. Avoid thinking about something, do the same thing you did before. Avoid thinking about something, do the same thing that everybody else is doing. And probably, even in this exalted company, we only take 2% of our decisions based on, oh, that's interesting, I'll have to think about that. And the issue in a model digital twin like Facebook's Dub is, well, actually, it's when those 2% of decisions are made where you have a significant risk of an emergent phenomenon, and where traditional models don't actually work very well, because the 4 models that were proposed before, essentially, yes, it's going to be a heuristic, but it's a machine learned heuristic. It's a rules-based one, that's definitely just heuristics. It doesn't get to that deep thought one. So we actually end up with a really challenging question. How do you predict community behaviors when people aren't simply applying heuristics? Now, I actually think this is the same thing that Monica mentioned. It's transdisciplinary and approaches everybody. But I think there's actually a complexity which I had not want. So sorry, step back. So how do you actually then model an agent? Well, you try and work out when do people, because your agent, your bot has to be a person, when do they think deeply? When is that 2%? And how do you apply that 2% into a digital twin to be able to see, is there an emergent phenomenon associated with that? I think there's also a second step, though, and some of this is because I did jury duty. And so spent 2 weeks of my life locked up with 11 people who were peers of the defendant, except that didn't quite feel like that, because 12 of us all had either were in or had professional careers. 11 had degrees. There were only 2 PhDs in the room of 12, which doesn't sound like a jury of peers anywhere else in the world. But the process that we went through is almost exactly the same as any other jury to come to a decision. And essentially, you can start to say, well, within groups, a group is likely to come to a better decision than an individual. Minds are changed, cues are taken, and actually there's a reasonable amount of work predominantly published by the Royal Society, which looks at, well, what size of groups actually makes good decisions? What are the cues that people take from interacting with others? Where most of the work says, all of these people that we tested, they did really weird cues, but actually came to the right answer in the end. And you can, if you can read that in a peer-reviewed journal article, the actual level of shock must have been significantly higher. It also starts to say, well, perhaps we can't just use the individual as the element, because the boundedly rational individual, if they interact locally with real other people, might end up with a slightly less bounded rational decision, but one which is definitely used some thinking rather than heuristics, and might actually change the nature of the model that you have to use in a digital twin of Facebook. So ultimately, this is all around collective wisdom, The wisdom of the crowds or herd mentality, they're both collective wisdom. And I'm particularly interested in how does co-design work, which I know is a real odd tangent, but in co-design, what do? You get a group of inexpert people to work with a group of expert people to come up with the design of something that the experts could have done on their own. And first view would say, well, if you've got, how many have we got here? We've got 8 experts in the room, and you bring me in and I'm a non-expert, so the average expertise has dropped because I'm coming in and I'm diluting the level of expertise. But actually, in great co-design processes, and there are some examples of this, you can end up with a better result from co-design than you do from having expert design. And this is scary. It's particularly scary in a regulated environment. But for example, Essential Energy, which is a distribution business in regional New South Wales, its tariffs are designed by its consumer consultative group. And that sounds really scary, because if your consumers are going to be designing your tariffs, aren't you going to end up with, well, actually electricity is free this year, or actually for 5 years, because it's a 5-year reset cycle. But you don't. You end up with tariffs which actually reflect consumer interests, but don't necessarily detract from the overall objectives of the environment under which those tariffs are set. And if that sounds particularly scary if you're the CEO of Essential, well, actually, no, because it's because the regulator accepts the tariffs, because they were consumer designed, they're actually likely to get much less pushback in a real world, because they're designed by the end customers of the retailers that acquire from them. So I'm sorry I've shifted away, but I think all of these issues of collective wisdom, as well as individual decisions, actually can lead to a richer digital twin model. So why is this interested in dis, and malinformation? Well, if we can start to see how misinformation, disinformation, malinformation flow across a social network, then the potential for this being applied to other environments is high, so that we can start to look at either twinning or modeling the way that misinformation and disinformation flows in other environments. It's quite neat, because you can actually start to say, well, if you took a graph theoretical approach, well, yes, actually you get the same types of outcomes as you would from using a digital twin. Similarly with game theory. So ultimately, what your digital twin is doing is not dissimilar to what you do with agent-based economics in economics, what you might do in applying an AI solution rather than using a regression model. You are actually seeing links back to older and better understood mathematical approaches, particularly the way in which hypergraphs and hyperlinks are formed, hypergames are formed in both of these, that flows from your modeling. So you can actually start to see, rather than just looking at a directed graph, where there are, instead of looking A, B, and C, where A, B, and C have links, but there is an A interaction with C, which is the hypergraph. The potential flows from this modeling to try and work out where those hypergraphs and hypergames are occurring. Okay, so what are my conclusions? Well, as I said before, my conclusions are, yeah, there's risks, there's models, and all the stuff that I've been going through. I think the place of future work is So we can probably work out how to model one person by working out when they make active decisions rather than heuristic decisions. But in reality, people interact, and that interaction can create collective wisdom. And I think, especially if we're going to be trying to look for emergent phenomena from complex adaptive systems, then we actually need to look separately at how small groups might interact. And that might be the family. It might be a small group of people who are of like mind that sit off to the one side of when they post on Facebook. So they're in a Facebook group, talk to each other, and what gets posted on Facebook is different because of that interaction. So I think there's a layer of complexity, and that layer of complexity is my next area of interest. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. Any other questions? Any questions?
Okay, all right. Well, it's not really questions, probably two thoughts that I have that inspired by our talk. One of them is that I really liked the explanation you gave for the digital twins in the banking sector. And that drives me to think about whether the CBDC, our distributed ledger technology, would play a key role here, given the certain properties such as the transparency and the accountability of the technology. So that's one of the thoughts. And the other one is about the example you gave on the collective wisdom, and also the last slides on the models of people and the cooperation of people. So I was thinking that in your example, for the jury example, it seems like we are really talking about the diversity of the knowledge and experience of the participants, in that example. And potentially that can be modeled by the entropy if we want to quantify the different background and expertise experience of the participants, and so that we could see how much entropy we have, what has been introduced that were not already being processed in the existing committee, so that we can have a better decision-making process.
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting approach. Some of the other approaches have been Bayesian by saying, oh, well, we probably can start to see a prior that's based on the whys, and then start to see changes which occur from the lay people joining the whys. So, but I hadn't thought about doing it from an entropy perspective. So it's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. I'm curious about, so you talked about this modeling for Facebook.
Yeah.
Given the massive amount of interactions and data that's being produced by Facebook, isn't their model supposed to be really, really, really accurate? Like even 99.9 is probably not good enough.
No, and their model is probably 97 to 98% accurate. And that's because they are essentially assuming that people employ only heuristics and don't think more deeply. And that's fine. That's more than fine for commercial modeling. Where it gets to be problematic is actually that problem of, or potential problem of, emergence. So if the emergence is good, lots of people click through advertising links, that's a fabulous outcome for Facebook. If the emergence is bad and leads to a reputational harm, that's bad for Facebook. So a 97% correct model or a 98% correct model is fine from a commercial perspective, but it's not fine for those risks, very high risk or very high reward outcomes. So that's where the limitation is. And that limitation is just essentially the way we think, because it's dead easy to model somebody who's going to use a heuristic each time. Monica liked it, so I'm going to like it. Chris liked it, so I'm going to move away from that site. That you've got those different heuristics that we use, but actually, so Mohammed liked it. Oh, now what does that mean for me? Do I like it? Do I move away from it? Should I comment on it? It might simply be the challenge of somebody that I've only just met, taking a particular view. I haven't determined whether I'm always going to like what they say or I'm always going to avoid what they say. So some form of thinking. So even if it's just as minimal as that, which is the interaction of new users for the first time, which is more an Instagram thing than a Facebook thing because the number of users dropping off, but that you would get to that part, which is quite hard to understand and quite hard to model.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
There's people online.
Yeah,
I love that talk, Rob. Thank you so much. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, there's no more. I want to hear more. I guess some comments and thoughts. I love that you're looking at groups, and I guess my mind's thinking of social identity theory and the contrast between that and Zimbardo's kind of group thinking stuff. So when you talked about the example of the jury, I think it was a really good example for us all to imagine, right? What I really liked listening to was that you all as a group tried to find a group identity. So, you know, your educational level was the identity, but you were a new group at first that were different to each other and then found each other, you know, as the flock, I suppose. And so social identity talks to, and you probably know all this anyway, but social identity talks to the fact that people are more likely to behave in a certain way when the group identity becomes salient. So if you look at your jury, for instance, if you remained with personal individual identities, it might have been harder to come to a conclusion together because you couldn't find where you all met. And so like you're saying, when you meet someone new, where do they fit in? Do they fit in with my group identity, my individual identity? And am I going to trust that? But I think, so social identity theory talks about how we can predict how people will behave as a consequence of the shared identity. But I think what your work is also saying is that there's a chance for groups to work together and change that group identity as well, which I find really interesting.
And change their identity in a way that even if there is one dominant person within the group, that dominant person effectively may dominate, but they may also form a minority subgroup of one, and the rest carry on and come up with a collective decision. So
I find that really interesting, that those possibilities when you've got so many masses together of that kind of movement of identity. And as you say, so once you have your group identity, then it's easier to predict the heuristic, then you're going to act according to the norm. But until that happens, I don't know if you know Cliff Stote's work in the UK at all. So Cliff does work on hooliganism, football hooliganism, which you know is a problem in the UK.
And in Melbourne sometimes.
I try to avoid those kind of, even looking at how that works. But so he's looked at when football fans go to Europe and, you know, they're all worried about them. And so sometimes the police, they bring in the riot police and everything to confront the English fans, knowing they're going to be in trouble, right? And so what he argues is when you have a situation where they're not dressed up as riot, but more like community policing, you're less likely to get this problem. And that's because it's not evoking the social identity of their hooligans, but rather that they're English fans. And so sometimes when there looks like there's trouble, there's been occasions when he's looked at it qualitatively where there was an example of saying, what are you doing? We're British. And so
Yeah.
looking at Britishness is different to being a football fan. So that kind of stuff seems to go alongside with what you're saying, is that it depends what group identity is going to be evoked by the meeting of the groups, but also the conditions around that as well.
Yes. Yeah, no. Over lunch, I'll grab a reference from you, if I may.
Because I'm a soccer fan, and I'm not sure if you heard about the last event. An English Premier League team went to a European final, and the French police treated all of them as hooligans. Yeah, so like I think these sort of things may also bring some prejudgments and false probably implications for example, I don't know, a French government and French police, that everyone I see coming to support this team is a hooligan, and they're gonna, I don't know, destroy something in Paris or. But eventually, I think they apologized because they didn't let
money
people,
back and paid the seats
and paid the entire all the supporters and all the fans back. So some of them, they had legitimate tickets, they couldn't go inside. So yes.
Yes, it was Liverpool fans. Yeah, but I think that it's important that the police also had a group identity that that was reinforced by the other groups. Yeah.
And it's probably a question that we can then take into lunch, which is about regulatory sandboxes.
Yeah.
And about the extent to which a lot of digital twin modeling might actually avoid the need for something as, at least theoretically, extreme as a regulatory. So a regulatory sandbox is where you essentially say you can experiment with new deployments of typically of technology, but it could be other things. And we will give you a perimeter, a safe space within which to work. And in the case of an AI deployment, that's some radical ideas, and for instance, the European Parliament are, oh, we'll just make most of AI a regulatory sandbox deployment opportunity. And it strikes me digital twinning might avoid some of the more extreme interpretations of, we are going to give this very, very broad space, particularly in view of what you've said about the kind of contagion effects of a lot of social uses of digital technologies.
I think that's right, Chris. I think the issue there is that if I'm a financial services provider of some means, I'm going to argue very strongly, don't need a sandbox because I've got a twin. Look at my twin. And arguably, even neobanks and other people who might want a sandbox to play in because they don't have the resources to build a digital twin could potentially go one of two paths. One is to say, this is so frustrating, I'm exiting. Generally has been the case historically. Or this sandbox is interesting, but I should be building a digital twin rather than playing in the sandbox. So when I graduate from the sandbox, my twin is ready. So I think it is important. But particularly, one of the reasons why businesses are quite happy to say, look at my twin, don't look at my physical world, because it's really messy and hard, the twin's accurate, is effectively to say, never sandbox me because you can see the twin. Which is fine when the twin is a genuine twin, but when the twin is an idealized version of the physical, that's when it gets to be problematic, particularly in prudential and supervisory regulation.
Yeah, and because the twin is only giving regulatory reporting, if you're a hybrid business like Silicon Valley Bank or Facebook or anybody else who has regulatory and non-regulated components to your business, then the digital twin you build for regulatory purposes is not a true representation of the business anyway. Of course, Silicon Valley Bank may well have gained the fact that they could actually find themselves lobbying themselves into a position of saying that they have a systemic risk bank, and therefore maybe their digital twinning internally was much more effective than we realized.
Well, I think in particular, Silicon Valley Bank managed to run without a risk officer for 8 months, which frankly should just not have been allowed in by any regulator or supervisor. So, yeah. Thank you.